All right, welcome back, everybody. I am Dr. Greg Eckel, and this is What the Health. And we have a very timely topic today for you when stored trauma is driving our health and life understanding and recognizing a biology of trauma. It's very timely for holidays. I've got Dr. Aimie Apigian. She's a board certified preventative and addiction medicine specialist with a double master's in biochemistry and public health. She specializes in trauma, attachment, and identifying, reversing the effects of stored emotions in the body and on our health. Having personal experience in foster parenting, adopting, and then her own chronic fatigue and autoimmune issues, she's discovered that negative life experiences become our biology, not just psychology. Comprising every system in our biology, these stored emotions cause inflammation, digestive issues, and contributes to all stages of disease and aging. Stored emotions become the biggest thief to our health, happiness, and aliveness without us ever knowing. So I really want to welcome on Dr. Aimie to What the Health. Welcome aboard.
Thank you, Dr. Eckel. I'm excited for the conversation, and yes, the holidays are a very timely topic for trauma.
It is, it's really, I think that it's extra special sauce, we'll call it, for the holidays. But more and more, this whole concept of trauma is really taking center stage ultimately where it needs to be, because this is the hidden thief. I love that you called it that. So many people don't understand it. You know, it's a loaded word, right? And we'll use triggering on purpose here, right? As people talk about getting triggered, or it's triggering my trauma, or, it's kind of almost said in jest these days, but it's a serious issue that often goes overlooked in all chronic illness, right? Would you agree?
I think it's so misunderstood that it's overlooked.
Yeah.
I think that if people really understood what trauma was and how it actually is a state of our biology, then it would land on people more, and it wouldn't just be like a passing joke about, triggers, or, oh, that was traumatizing, or these other ways in which we make light of it, which again, like, I use a lot of humor in my work. So I'm hoping that there's no negative energy that needs to come into our conversations around trauma, but this is really the foundation of our biology and what drives our biology, either for health or for disease on all levels.
I agree. I think we can definitely leave humor as allowed on the podcast always. and it is, it's almost bantered about in younger generations. Like, I have a daughter in high school now, and the way that it's just kind of like nonchalantly talked about, it's like, well, we're actually minimizing it. Like, it's almost brushed off as like, oh, that's triggering me. It's like a conversation stopper. And while I think it actually should be really a leaning in opportunity for us to really understand it, because it is so many times. So I've been in practice for 21 years, and you will see people in their 70s and 80s release traumas that they have carried around with them for 7 decades, that happened when they were children. And to realize, like, wow, that was stored in there. Like, one of my initial stories of this was, as a student, I adjusted a woman. She had chronic asthma, and I adjusted her back, and she broke out in tears. And I thought, oh my gosh, I broke a rib. Like, what happened? And she said, no, you just released this, like, this memory just got released out of my body, and her asthma attack stopped, and nothing else was working for her. So that, I was so excited to see you coming on board today to really unpack this whole conversation of, like, setting the stage and allowing us the ability to talk about it and understand it, because there's a whole level of people getting stuck in their trauma, or just not knowing that they even have trauma, right? So let's start with maybe stored trauma in the body and its effects. Like, what does this look like? Like, maybe define trauma. We have physical and emotional, and, there's all kinds of levels to this. So I'm going to just kind of lob that over to you and see where we go.
Well, it's a important question, and it's a big question, and yet actually it's a very simple answer. Most people still identify with trauma as being something psychological. And so they identify, oh, that's a trigger. I'm anxious, I'm depressed, and it's all things that I need to work out with my thoughts. I need to change my thoughts around it. I need to do that. Or like you say, they kind of use triggers as almost like an excuse for being closed off, or having to put up boundaries, or having to limit themselves because, oh, that's triggering for me, rather than being able to see it as, and you can change that. That is not something that needs to limit you. That's actually something like what you were saying. You can lean into that and have that be the beginning of a conversation, the beginning of understanding, because there is so much that we can do to rewire the nervous system where trauma is actually stored. So when we look at what is trauma, we want to differentiate stress from a trauma. And again, this is a concept that most people walk around kind of mixing the two, and being able to understand that. Yeah.
Hold on one second. So I want to get to that stress versus trauma, but there's a little bit of static on your microphone that I want to make sure we kind of don't get that going.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that is.
I can put in my earbuds quick and see if that helps.
Yeah, let's try that, because I don't want to lose people in our conversation because it's so important for that to share.
Yeah, and I appreciate you letting me know.
Yeah.
I'm not using my usual microphone, so.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, so that component of I'm just kind of putting the pin in that where we were, because I know I just took the air out of your wind up there. Let's try that. How's that sounding?
How is that sounding?
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much. Yes. Yeah. Awesome. All right. So winding back up, I'm lobbing it back over to you of the event versus stored trauma, right? I think that's where you were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that would be another common misconception, is that trauma is an event. Trauma is not an event at all. Yeah. An event is something external from us, and trauma is something that happens inside of us in our bodies. So that's why there are many people who have patterns of trauma in their body, in their nervous system, and yet never identify like a clear event, because trauma is not an event. Trauma is an experience. And so whatever your experience of something, that experience can be overwhelming for your body. And that right there is actually the best definition of trauma, is anything that for whatever reason at that time overwhelmed your survival system. And what would have happened is that there is this response that the body, that the nervous system does. This is a very subconscious thing. It's not something that you can control. Yeah. And when there is any type of a sense of threat, then it goes into the stress response. But if that threat, if the stress, for whatever reason, again, like for whatever reason, it becomes overwhelming to your biology, and your nervous system literally thinks like, "Ooh, I don't know if I have enough of whatever it is to get through this." Okay, then it's actually going to go into a dorsal vagal response or a freeze response. And anytime it does that, like that then has the potential for trauma, because we don't necessarily go through and complete that cycle. And so all of that energy of the stress gets stored and stuck in our tissues on a cellular level. And so trauma is something that is going to cause lasting change on our biology, whereas a stress is something where it returns back to its baseline health before that stress. And so there are two reasons for these trauma patterns getting put into our nervous system. And this hopefully will help people identify like, oh yeah, I can relate to that. And so two reasons. One would be things happen too much too fast. Or and this is where it can be an event where it's like a big natural disaster. It's like everything was too big and it was too fast, and I couldn't process all of it at that time. And so that's a very normal, the trauma response is a very normal response of the body, designed to help us get through tough life situations. And so that would be a normal time for our body to get overwhelmed with things and go into this freeze response or experience a trauma. The other reason for a trauma response would be having too little of something that we need for too long. And so this gets into all this other area, Dr. Eckel, where it's like, what would have been an experience where you had too little of something and you had to hold on for too long, and that's what caused overwhelm in your system. Looking just at early childhood, it can just be, not enough eye contact, not enough touch, not enough of something that you really needed at that time in your life, and it just wasn't good enough, wasn't quite enough. And that causes overwhelm. But certainly as we get later on in life and we start to develop what I call a biology of trauma, then we start to see these nutrient deficiencies or sometimes nutrient overloads, or we have mitochondrial compromises. And so now we're experiencing too little of something on an internal level. And on the cellular level, we have maybe too little of magnesium for too long. And that's going to cause our system to be like, oh, I can't do this anymore. I need to start shutting down in order to conserve energy and be able to survive this. So a trauma response is always about shutting down in order to conserve energy and to get through something, either because it was too much too fast, too many events, right? Like, so people will describe this happened and then this happened and then this person passed away and then this, right? And it's just like, it was way too much. That's an example of too much too fast. Many times of abuse, right? Like that would be an example of too much too fast. I wasn't strong enough at that time. And so the threat was too big and it happened all too fast. And I didn't have time or the strength to fight back. But then you have these other situations where it's too little of something that the human body needs. And you're having to live with too little for too long and your body just can't hold on.
So that's awesome differentiation there. And those components, I'm guessing people have different thresholds for each of those.
Exactly.
And so there's a whole kind of the epigenetic component. So maybe if we tie that into, why does the trauma event or too little of something, why two people in the same situation, one person really is devastated and it impacts their trajectory. The other person just kind of says, well, that was something.
Stressful.
Yeah. Right.
So much of what we have started to understand around trauma is the role of oxidative stress in trauma. And what you're talking about, I call that capacity. So what is a person's capacity for stress before it becomes overwhelming? Because once they reach that line of overwhelm, that is trauma land. And so we want to look at a person's capacity for holding stress and how much stress, whatever form that stress comes in, how much stress can their body hold before crossing that line of overwhelm into actually trauma and all of the biology changes that happen with that. And so there are so many things, right?
Yeah.
You in your practice have seen so many things that affect a person's capacity for stress. And even when we just look at the example of a joint, right? Or a muscle or a tendon, and it's like, how much stress can we put on that before it snaps, before it breaks, before that's just too much? And it's the same thing with the nervous system. We have this capacity and all of these different things go into that capacity. It definitely starts with even in utero experiences and genetics. But as you say, there's this whole epigenetic component as well. And epigenetics really does feed into this idea of the oxidative stress that I was talking about. And the more oxidative stress that starts to accumulate, the lower and lower capacity we have. And it becomes this vicious cycle because the more trauma that we experience, right? Trauma is an experience, not an event. The more trauma that we experience, that results in higher and higher levels of oxidative stress. So now we're just in this vicious feedback cycle that can be very hard to get out of if you don't know how, if you don't have those tools. And so then that starts to cause all of this damage to the DNA. And then that starts to cause changes in your neurotransmitters and in your DNA expression. And so one of the big focuses on even full-blown PTSD is really addressing the oxidative stress and the role that that has in those symptoms.
Interesting. So let's unpack that one. So is PTSD considered an epigenetic condition?
Yes.
And so help us with that. So, I mean, here I live in Portland, Oregon. We treat a lot of the police force here in my clinic, and they've just spent, 180 to 200 days under fire, where I would suspect that there is a ton of PTSD. I mean, these are real people out on the streets, right? But other officers don't have any issues with it. So what is that? How do you explain that?
So we look at their capacity, and why would they have a different capacity than somebody else? Mm-hmm. What are, and there's all these different factors. So we can look at their early neurodevelopment, and there are key events in neurodevelopment that need to happen in order to build a nervous system that has a bigger capacity. And so if those certain things did not happen, for example, like enough time on their tummy on the floor, they would not have gotten the movements and the patterns that they needed to properly develop their nervous system. So some of this is very, very structural, very anatomical, very sciencey, right? It's not, we're not talking emotional stuff here. Like this is actual sensory integration and how the nervous system developed in those very early formative years, because that's the foundation then upon which all else is built. And so just through those neurodevelopmental stages, we can look at a person's capacity at that early age and whether they feel generally secure or whether they feel generally insecure in the world. And that's going to put them on two very different paths in terms of their biology and then their capacity. But then we also want to look at their overall burden, right? And in functional medicine, we do these timelines and we look at, all right, let's look at all the different infections you've had. Let's look at all the different medications you've had. Let's look at everything. And the more of, the more infections we have had, the more medications, antibiotics, all of this stuff, it just accumulates. Right. And so then it's like, well, we started with this capacity for stress, but these things have all been stressful. And so now we're really just limited to having this capacity for life stress. And that's a very limited capacity. And so they much more quickly go into PTSD and overwhelm. But then we can look at genetics, right? And there are some genetics where some people have lower levels activity of their serotonin, of their dopamine neurotransmitters. And there is this huge emotional component to those too, because those are very key in neurodevelopment. And did you get enough eye contact? Did you get eye contact at the right time? Or was it maybe even too much? And those can influence neurotransmitters. But we know that people with lower levels in those neurotransmitters are prone to experiencing life events as a trauma rather than just as a stress. Yeah. And then we look at their current lifestyle, right? Because that's a big role, right? In their capacity for stress. Are they sleeping? Are they actually giving themselves rest? Or are they coming home and turning on the TV and keeping themselves in front of the screen that we know that just its effect on the nervous system is not going to allow it the restorative rest that it needs in order to fill the tank back up and have a capacity full enough to handle their very tough job. So we look at then their diet, right? Their current diet, but then also things in the past. And is their diet something that is feeding food sensitivities and leaky gut and inflammation, because we know that the inflammation in the gut is going to travel up the vagus nerve into the brain and be causing brain inflammation, especially if someone has had any kind of head injuries in the past. That's another setup for this biology of trauma and actually being more predisposed to trauma, because now you have what are called primed microglia and these cells in your nervous system and in your brain that are already set to just instantly release all of this inflammation cascade, causing the brain fog and anxiety and depression. And we know though, that if you have these prime microglia, leaky gut and inflammation in the gut is going to cause those to be reactivated again too. So alcohol, right? Like alcohol would be another one of those factors where if you're already limited on your capacity, it's just going to further kind of put you into the hole in terms of your capacity for stress, because of its a direct effect on the nervous system, making it more reactive when it does not have the numbing effect of alcohol. But then also the alcohol will reactivate those primed microglia and putting you in the brain fog and some fatigue. And so then now you're reaching for caffeine because now you're feeling tired and you've got to stay up. I mean, it just becomes this really vicious cycle. And now you're running off of adrenaline, right? Many people get to the point in their life where they're running off of adrenaline, and they can only do that for so long before their body collapses and just kind of lands in what I call a chronic freeze state, where it's just constantly exhausted and overwhelmed. And it requires a large amount of adrenaline to pull yourself out of that exhaustion, to get something done, to meet a deadline, to show up to work. But then you're coming home and you're crashing again into that exhaustion. And that's a very common cycle of biology of trauma that I see.
And so I want to definitely talk about this freeze response component and how people know if they're living in a chronic freeze state, because that is something where, folks don't even notice. They just shut down and they're gone. They just, displace themselves from their bodies almost. But that coupled with kind of our current pandemic of insecure attachment. So because these kind of go together, because
they totally do. Yeah.
This tidal wave of the events of the world are just, it's this nonstop barrage of putting people into a fear state and the reactivity. And you really said it well, like, are you seeing the world as a secure place or an insecure place? And so I'm wondering, is that what you mean by the current pandemic of insecure attachment, or is that a different concept?
I think what the pandemic has done is it has just revealed how much of the society actually has an insecure attachment style, and how much their nervous system is already feeling basically insecure, lost, unsure, confused, and very easy prone to fear-based responses and reactions. And so it used to be that only 80% of the population had an insecure attachment. And honestly, right now, like I would say it's 95% of the population. Like this is our new normal. And it's been this way. It's just that the pandemic opened our eyes to be able to see that based on a lot of things, right? At first it was just the unknown. There's this virus. We don't even know what it is. We don't know where it's coming from. And so for the body's natural survival response, it needs to be able to clearly identify the threat and what can I do about it in order to stay out of the freeze. The freeze response is a result of not knowing what to do and not being able to do anything. And so then it's like, well, I'm just going to turn all of that energy inward and go into the collapse because I'm not able to actually make any movement and action towards self-protection. But then there were all the social changes, right? And even just looking at isolation, right? Like isolation is something that triggered, and it should, like isolation is not normal. It's not natural. And so for somebody who was already feeling like I'm barely getting through in life, and then to have that isolation put on them, it was a very, that was the line in which they crossed into overwhelm. And it's been really sad to see the effects on those who do have a substance use problem, do have an addiction, do have a dependence on a substance, whether that be alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, whatever it is, because those, with the social changes that happened, their other coping mechanisms for stress were taken away. And then they're really only left with their very, very unhealthy coping mechanism. And so it drove a lot of people deeper and deeper into their use, into their addiction. And we've had a huge increase, at least a 30% increase in overdose deaths, unintentional, unintentional overdose deaths just since the start of the pandemic.
Wow, a 30% increase. And also, I think greater than 30% increase of prescriptions for antidepressants and anxiolytics as well.
Oh, yes. And we're not even talking about the sales of alcohol, right?
Right.
Like, those businesses have done very well during the pandemic.
Right, right. The essentials for coping mechanisms. And
Yeah.
so, anyone listening, this is in your family. I mean, this is all around us. We're seeing like a 95%, even previously 80% of the population was in an insecure state.
Absolutely.
For variety of reasons of the whole litany that Dr. Aimie just went through there. Like, it's stacked against us, right? Our nervous system is stacked to keep us alive, but at a certain point, it becomes dysfunctional and is the root of the issue, right? That's like our wiring and our programming. So what biology predisposes us to experiencing trauma then?
Yeah, and this is what
and then I want to get back to the freeze state because I want to explain that a little bit more for folks. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So what we're seeing is that more people than ever are actually predisposed to experiencing trauma. More people than ever are prone to trauma. And why is that? Well, it also actually comes down to some social changes around the support of the family, support of the mom, and those early newborn stages where that connection is absolutely critical. And so when we have a society that pushes moms to go back into work, or is not allowing her the support that she needs to fully dedicate her time and energy and everything to that newborn, then that right there is setting them up for this predisposition for trauma. So it's changes that happen in the nervous system that make it more reactive, that make it more sensitive for life because of those neurodevelopmental stages that it just wasn't enough to create a sense of security and safety. So that would be the social changes and how those have been affecting our biology. But then we actually do have some genetic conditions, even some things that would be kind of environmental or lifestyle. So there are some most common biochemical imbalances that I see in those who have these types of patterns in their nervous system. So much so that anybody coming to work with me, I'm almost always asking them to get these tests to start off with, because once we start addressing these, then it creates a new baseline for them and their health and their emotions. And it's like, then it becomes clear what the next step is and what the next lowest hanging fruit is in their biology. So the three most common biochemical imbalances I see is methylation issues and high copper or low zinc. So that kind of high copper ratio. And then something called pyroluria, which is both a genetic condition that results in low zinc and B6, which are essential nutrients for the nervous system. It actually stabilizes the nervous system. And we know that it gets worse in times of stress. So if right, it's like kind of stacked against you again, where you've already got this genetic predisposition to be more reactive, to be more sensitive. And so you're more stressed at baseline, which makes the condition even worse. So once we identify those, wow, what a difference those can make in just stabilizing things. Not that it cures everything at all. I am not saying that, but it just brings things down to a more manageable level, that it allows us to even do some of the emotional work, to do some of the trauma therapies, because before then they're way too reactive. And what will happen is that they'll go to do therapy and they will actually experience flare-ups of their chronic health conditions. So if they've got an autoimmune condition, for example, this is a time when, they think that they're doing a good thing by going into therapy or even, a counselor and talking about stuff. And then next thing they know, they're back up in a flare up of their autoimmune or their arthritis or their IBS or some of these other chronic health conditions. And it's a result of their body not being stable enough to have the capacity for that work.
Wow. So that really never gets talked about right there is, we're going to go into counseling and therapy, but their biochemistry and biology can't support the reenactment or the exploration of the system. Wow. So
Right.
that's
In
awesome.
essence, what's happening, Dr. Eckel, is it's actually re-traumatizing them.
Yeah.
Because when I see someone who's experiencing a flare-up of their chronic health condition as a result of therapy, that tells me that we just overwhelmed your system.
Yeah.
And overwhelm is trauma. Like they're synonymous. Those are the same exact things. It just happens on a biology level. Many people, again, think of overwhelm as an emotional thing. It's not. It's happening on a cellular level. And so literally it is overwhelming their system and re-traumatizing their body rather than it being helpful.
Wow. Wow. So that that can explain a lot for folks, perhaps if you're listening and you've got ultra sensitivities, or really we see a lot of folks here at Nature Cures that are really kind of on that teetering edge. They can't go back, and they're just so afraid to go forward because they're just so tenuously like kind of got everything put together. But if I do any little item out, I'm going to topple. And that really does explain the component for these folks around would you call it an unresolved trauma, or it's just trauma that is still playing out in the body or hasn't been expressed or cleared? How do you?
Yeah, you can call it unresolved trauma. I generally refer to it as stored trauma,
Okay.
or trauma patterns, or a biology of trauma. And the idea is that it is something that's happening in your biology, not just in your psychology.
Yeah.
And that's why you experience physical symptoms and physical conditions directly correlated to this stuff. And it's not just your thoughts and your behaviors.
Sure. Okay, so when the system gets overloaded for whatever reason, right?
Doesn't matter. It does not matter.
It doesn't matter. It just gets overloaded.
Yeah.
That situation basically can result in a freeze response. So like basically the system just shuts down. So how do people know if that's happening to them? How do they know if they're living in a chronic freeze state?
Many people think that a freeze state literally means that they stand there frozen.
Right. Yes.
No, that's
Right.
not it. So what a chronic functional freeze is, and I use that term because they are able to function.
Sure.
I mean, I literally lived most of my life in a functional freeze response. I got myself through medical school. I got myself through residency, all mostly in a functional freeze response. So it's not that you are completely unfunctional. It's just that it's compromising your ability to be fully present, to be actually connected. And that's what trauma does. So trauma disconnects us from our body because what's happening in our body is so uncomfortable that our nervous system decides, you know what? This is taking too much energy to pay attention to the body. And it's actually, bringing us down, slowing us down. And so we're going to just kind of cut off all of the sensations and do that. So how would people know if they are in a chronic functional freeze state? We already talked about one pattern, and that is just this sense of exhaustion and fatigue and overwhelm. So even if you find yourself using that language like, oh my goodness, this is way too much, that's talk of the freeze response. I'm overwhelmed. If you are using those words, that's a freeze response. There are so many patients that I've had over the years who come in and they just kind of sit down, and I always just kind of pause and let things settle when they come in before just jumping in, and just usually with enough of that pause and they start just kind of crumbling. You can see their posture and their shoulders slump, their head comes down. That is the freeze response posture. So anytime I see that, I know that I'm working with a freeze pattern. And then they'll start to say words like, it's just been way too much. Way too much. They're not saying that it's been a lot, because if they're saying it's been a lot, well, then that could still be a stress, but they're using language that this is just way too much. And so just noticing your language that you use can help a person know like, I think I might actually be in overwhelm quite a bit of the time. Another way to tell is if you, again, kind of like need to run off of adrenaline in order to get things done. So
Going
that,
to the coffee shop and having the 4 espressos in your coffee.
for example, or even excessive exercise.
Mm.
Right? There are other ways to get those, that adrenaline, the endorphins. And so any of those types of things, this is where an addiction, right? Like the excitement of an addiction and the anticipation of the use, that all causes adrenaline and these endorphins. And so that's how it kind of naturally moves in that direction when someone has these kinds of trauma patterns. But then we also can look at coping mechanisms, and coping mechanisms is a great way to identify if there is a freeze pattern, and any coping mechanisms that we use in order to escape. So people escape into Netflix, people escape into social media, people escape into food, right? Like any people, those people who experienced weight gain during COVID and isolation, they were probably doing some emotional eating, right? And that is a pattern of the freeze response of actually using food to numb down some of the sensations coming up in the body and being able to make things feel more manageable, whether that be boredom, whether that be sadness and grief, whether that be anger, whether that be fear. All of those emotions can easily become too much for somebody who is used to being disconnected from all of that. And so when a person sees himself using a coping mechanism to numb feelings, to manage feelings, or to escape, then that is a clear freeze pattern. The last thing that I'll say about how to identify it is based on your symptoms and some of the physical, actually health conditions. So there are specific conditions and diagnoses even that are squarely landing in a chronic freeze state. And that would be the autoimmune stuff, would be chronic pain, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, or any of those types of things, and depression. So all of those, if a person has experienced those, we know that they have this, pattern to go into the freeze more easily than other people. And certainly if this is something that is active in their life, then it's a pretty strong pattern in their life for again, it's just a reflection of their system becoming overwhelmed and shutting down. I really want to communicate that there's nothing wrong, right? This is not bad. It is what it is. And actually, once we identify what's happening, it actually frees us up because we understand it rather than being confused by it. And part of what keeps a person in a chronic freeze state is being confused about what's going on with my body. I don't understand my health condition. Everything that I seem to do doesn't seem to work. And then we start getting into that, and this is too much. And just that sense, then these conditions can even promote kind of getting stuck in this chronic freeze state and feeling like life is just too hard.
So let's speak into that getting stuck on the healing journey from trauma, because that happens. A lot of folks will feel like, I did the counseling, I did the work. Why the hell do I still have these symptoms? Like what? Why won't it go away? When is it all out of me? Yeah.
And so we have this, we have two different cycles. There's a cycle of trauma that can happen, or there is a cycle of health and wholeness. They are independent of each other. You cannot have both of them happening at the same time. You either have one or you have the other. And a cycle of trauma is one where your nervous system is what I call dysregulated, which just means that it's hard to manage. It's hard to bring down into that state where you actually feel secure. So you're either in anxiety or you're in overwhelm. Either one of those are what would be considered dysregulation. And that dysregulation of the body, again, happens on the autonomic nervous system level. It's not something that happens in the mind. It's something that happens on the autonomic nervous system level down to the cellular level. And that actually feeds our thoughts and our beliefs about ourselves and how we see the world. And so we also know that our thoughts influence our biology. And so again, just kind of talking about it before, we start to have this loop that feeds off of itself, where our body and the dysregulation that's happening in our body is informing our thoughts, and our thoughts are giving that feedback. Yep, let's definitely stay in fear. Let's definitely stay in anxiety. Let's definitely stay in overwhelm. And then from there, that feeds into this biology of trauma, which is again going to feed into our thoughts and further contribute to the dysregulation. And so when you try to just tackle one of those, you're not gonna be successful. You're gonna get stuck. So say, for example, someone is going to go into therapy and they're going to talk about it. They're only addressing that cognitive part of this cycle. Mm. And because both the biology and the autonomic nervous system and its dysregulation are still feeding into that cognitive part, you're not going to experience lasting change. You may experience some relief momentarily, but as soon as you get off the meditation pillow, as soon as you get off the yoga mat, right? As soon as you, whatever it is, then it kind of is all back. And that's because we haven't addressed these other aspects of the cycle that are continuing to feed into it. But same thing, right? Like if you are only going to try to address the emotional part and you're not addressing the biology and you're not addressing the actual concepts and beliefs about yourself and these parts of you that have developed and adapted to your life and that tell you stories about yourself and about other people, you're not going to be successful because that's only one aspect of this cycle. Mm-hmm. So you really have to address all three aspects. And when you do that, oh my goodness, like magic happens and people are shocked at how fast their system is able to make shifts when they're addressing all of those components. But without addressing those, that is definitely when people get stuck.
Yeah. And that is, I love the full court approach that you've got there. And you've also given our listeners a great guide here too. So we've got the link, because I'm guessing folks, if you've made it this far in the podcast, you're probably like, okay, well, where's the good news here, folks? Where doctors help? So you have a guide for the chronic freeze response on your Trauma Healing Accelerated website there. So we've got that link in our show notes here for you. And also, kind of taking the last third perhaps of our time together of giving some options for folks, because obviously this is so widespread and of pandemic proportions. It's just, there is trauma. And we didn't even talk, I guess, on the epigenetic component around maybe the ancestral linking to how that plays out for, I guess that's more, of the tidal wave of all of the possibilities that are causing it. How there's a ton of information coming out around polyvagal theory. And so how do you apply that to medicine?
Polyvagal theory, it develops out of the work of Stephen Porges, and certainly there were people who were starting to see this before, but he was able to actually name it and describe it in a way that landed. And so it's a beautiful contribution to the field, and such a necessary contribution to the field, because it goes back to one of the misconceptions that most people still have about our stress and survival response. So most people think of a stress response as either fight, flight, or freeze, right? It's like, we know that so well, it just rolls off of our tongue. And that's actually wrong. It's 100% wrong. And it blows my mind that Stephen Porges has put this out there for so long now. And yet even in my medical school training, right, it was taught fight, flight, or freeze. And this is medicine. This is physicians. And we're being trained this. So I learned all of this out of experimenting with my own system. And so my goal is to use my experiences in order to help other people with their freeze response, because I have done everything wrong. and so, yes, I can definitely help guide people in terms of, all right, we've got this, and this is what we do. And so when we look at what is this, what am I dealing with? This is the freeze response, and a freeze response is the polyvagal. So to help people understand what polyvagal is, because they may not be familiar with that, we have a vagus nerve, And that vagus nerve controls so much of our autonomic nervous system, from our breathing to our heart beating and all of our digestive system. And the vagus nerve comes out of our brainstem, and then it travels and it actually goes behind the esophagus, which is partly why emotional eating actually works to help with emotions, because the vagus nerve is right there and it's activating that vagus nerve. And then we can even talk about the stomach and it expanding and totally activating the vagus nerve there. But that's a separate conversation. The vagus nerve, what Stephen Porges was able to really clearly delineate, was that it has two origins in the brainstem that had not previously really been explained or understood well. And so there's what we call a nucleus, right? A nucleus is just the origin of a nerve in that nervous system tissue. And there's a front side and there's a back side. It's as simple as that. It's anatomical. And that back side is called the dorsal. Dorsal is Latin for back. So we call it the dorsal vagal response. And this is literally when you have crossed that line from stress into overwhelm, and your system switches in a moment's time from full-on sympathetic to shutting everything down through that, now communicating through the dorsal nucleus of the vagus, and it travels down that nerve, and it just literally tells everything, all right, we're shutting down. And it's like turning off the engines and flipping the switches and going into full on energy conservation mode. So nothing is going to work well, right? And so people, when I see certain symptoms, I know that we're working with a dorsal vagal, and this is the polyvagal in medicine and what it looks like. A lot of digestive issues, because the vagus nerve is not working well. It's not in rest and digest mode. It is in freeze and shut down, and we're just going to do the bare minimum to stay alive. And so everything from the acid production in the stomach to the enzymes coming out of your pancreas to the actual motility of your gut and the absorption of nutrients and the inflammation that can develop and the gut microbiota, all of that is disrupted with this polyvagal and freeze response. So that would be one thing. Then we can look at even just muscle tension and bracing and some of those patterns that we see that's part of the vagal freeze response in medicine. And again, I've already mentioned the conditions that are associated with that. So the autoimmune, right, would be a huge one that we know often takes decades to develop after an initial polyvagal response has been started in someone and led to this chronic freeze pattern and response. So polyvagal theory is all over medicine, and I really truly believe that is a big part of the future of medicine.
It the great wandering nerve, cranial nerve 10, the vagal nerve, it does touch so much of our autonomic nervous system and these processes that we're not consciously aware of. And to see it play out here as an underpinning of the signaling nature of trauma response or stuck trauma in the body, it really can explain a lot of chronic illness. And so it goes, that's why I was so excited to have you on to share this information with folks, because, if you're struggling, and most folks, I like to kind of joke, like, people wind up in our clinic here because they've been to see all of the experts around the globe. And they just never get this type of attention or detail or discussion around their health. And, it is such an underpinning that our cells hold on to this information, like every single cell of our body. There's a lot of cells there. And so there are ways, what would you suggest? I mean, just kind of in the last bit of the show here, obviously getting a thorough evaluation and an understanding of what is going on with their bodies. But in the meantime, because the holidays are rapidly approaching, and maybe, more libations and more sugar, and we're adding into the stress levels that potentially trigger us to that event of overwhelm and freeze, or into a trauma component. What do you recommend for folks of just some simple things to do?
Yeah, and it depends on where they are in the stages of their journey. So I've got a guide on the actual stages of the healing journey, and the first stage is boring uh, because it's really just becoming aware. Because we cannot do anything until we actually understand the pattern. And again, we are a society that is driven towards performance and doing, right? And so we want to get in there and we want to do something. Like we want to change it. And it's like, well, let me tell you, right? Like that's what I tried to do. And let me tell you what happened, right? Like I got very sick and my system crashed and I was in bed for several months. Yeah. So what happens is that when we have used coping mechanisms, and maybe I'm thinking about it, so let me just back up. Sure. All coping mechanisms are merely an adaptive response to our environment, to our overwhelm, to our stress. And so coping mechanisms, we naturally think of them as bad, but they are actually helping us survive. And so if you come in and you say, all right, I recognize that I'm an emotional eater, right? I definitely used to be that. So what I did was okay, I'm going to stop eating. I'm even going to go on a diet because I needed to lose several pounds because of that. So I completely put all of my focus on this one coping mechanism that I thought was bad and was ruining my life. And what I found was like, oh my goodness, no, like it is what is helping me manage my emotions so that I can even show up to work and get my work done and get through my day. And now you've just taken what before was an anxiety, and now it's like a full-blown panic, and my body just could not handle that and it shut down. So as much as we want to just jump in and change something that we see as bad, you can try that, but until we replace it with something else that's going to help regulate your nervous system, it's going to end in disaster. And so the first thing really is, I want to know, what pattern do you have? Are you mostly a person who is stuck in anxiety and sympathetic? Or are you a person who is back and forth between overwhelm on the weekends and in the evenings, but then stressed during the day? Or are you so far into this that you are always now exhausted and overwhelmed and full blown into your symptoms and your diseases, and you're always in chronic freeze? Because those are very different patterns to work with. And so being able to understand, first of all, just where are you? What is your pattern? Because then that informs us of where to start. So I would really encourage people to start noticing the words that they use, right? Just noticing their language. And if they're able to change their language, awesome, right? Rather than using the words, this is too much, just change it to, this is a lot. This feels like a lot. But don't use those words of it's too much, because now you've committed yourself to feeling overwhelmed. But if, just noticing your words, noticing your emotions, noticing your energy, noticing your health conditions and your symptoms, and then that will start to paint a picture for you. And then that informs us of where we can start.
Perfect. I love that. That's a great suggestion, rather than, what can I just take for this, doctor? You actually want the awareness and being in the body. So that's great. And I'm guessing that really gets detailed in your 21-day journey, right? Yes. So that link is also in the show notes as well, traumahealingaccelerated.mykajabi.com. You'll see it in the show notes, folks. These are amazing resources, Dr. Aimie. And, I think with kind of coming down to the tail end, are there any, in the last 3 minutes, anything that you would like to share with our listeners and viewers out there?
Yeah, there is so much hope. And that's really what I want to share. I see that people feel like trauma is something that they're stuck with for the rest of their life, and that they just have to accommodate it right? And even like coddle it and take care of it and make sure not to bump it, because then it spills over and makes messes. So, we walk around living very rigid in order to accommodate this thing called trauma. And it does not need to be that way. And I'm thinking of so many people now who've gone through the 21-day journey, and they are experiencing amazing shifts that they never even knew about. So like some of them never noticed that they had tension in their jaw until they go through a 21-day journey, and they're like, oh my goodness, I never noticed that before. Their digestive systems are turning on, their energy levels are going up, and they don't know why, right? They're not taking anything different. They're not eating anything different. And it's like, well, yeah, this is the work that happens when we start to become aware and then go through what I call the essential sequence that I walk people through in the 21-day journey to actually address these patterns in a safe way that actually helps keep things together while we go through this process and not makes them fall apart, like is a very common experience.
That's very important, not to go through it falling apart. That's lovely.
Let's not re-traumatize you.
Right.
We're supposed to be changing that.
So that they actually can get through it to the other side into more wholeness and accessing their full creativity and all of the love that they can muster, right? That's the goal for why we do what we do. Any last parting wisdom? I mean, that's spectacular right there. But any further?
Yeah, I guess my last parting wisdom would be, let's really challenge this idea that trauma is just our thoughts, and that we just need to change our mindset and change our thoughts and really start to see it for what it is. This is a state of our biology, and that's where we can put so much of our focus and really start to make grounds in the emotional work when we focus on the biology piece as well.
I love it. This is the work here, folks. So if you loved this show, please share it. Share it with your friends. Share it with your family. Share it with your communities. Share the show. Also, give us a 5-star review so that we can get this word out, because this is the message. Like this is the deep healing. This is at the root of illness right here, this trauma component. And Dr. Aimie, thank you so much for sharing this wisdom with us and your courses. Everybody, this is why I created What the Health in this platform. We are here Tuesdays from 2 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard on the Contact Talk Radio. We will see you next week. Bye, everybody.